Reverend Peggy Meeker is the minister of the Brockport Unitarian Universalist Church, Universalist Fellowship, I should read this card, Universalist Fellowship, and instructor of Unitarian Universalist courses at Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School, where she received her Master of Divinity in 2008. And she also facilitates a bereavement support group at Lifetime Care. So please welcome Reverend Peggy Meeker.
My job is to introduce to you our two speakers for tonight's debate. First, Mr. Dan Courtney, President Emeritus of the Free Thinkers of Upstate New York and an outspoken atheist. He is a graduate of Clarkson University and enjoys challenging the conventional notions of religion and God to help improve society. Dan is also the author of the book, A Gift from God, How Presuppositionalism Undermines Christianity. He has 2 sons and 2 stepdaughters and lives with his wife in Hilton, New York. Dan is the gentleman on the left with the light jacket. Mr. Jon Kaus is the Director of Operations and teaches apologetics and senior thesis at Veritas Academy. He graduated with a degree in accounting from St. John's University, Minnesota. He worked for 3.5 years with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, where he was the area director. Recently, he has worked for Taylor Corporation, where he developed a greeting card brand called Berry. Jon is married to his wife, Krista, and they have 3 children, Lydia, Henry, and Silas. Mr. Kaus. So here's what's going to happen. Each debater will have 20 minutes for their opening presentation. Then we will have a first rebuttal, 10 minutes each. First cross-examination, 5 minutes each. Second rebuttal, 5 minutes each. Second cross-examination, 5 minutes each. Closing statements, 5 minutes each. And then time for a few questions from the audience. I give you Mr. Courtney.
So, as Peggy mentioned, tonight's debate is Does God Exist? Before I dive right in, I want to thank Jon for making the trip up here. I really appreciate the effort. Actually, it was Jon that suggested that we do a series of 2 debates. This is the second. The first one we did on morality down at his home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Not his home, but a church where he lives down in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So this is the second of the series. Thank you very much, Peggy, for the introductions. I want to thank Susan Galloway for helping us film the debate, and also my brother, Bill Courtney, on the manning the other camera, and of course the RIT Skeptics for hosting the debate. Thank you very much. Okay, so it was Sam Harris, the neuroscientist and author, and sometimes called one of the new atheists, that argued that religion is presented by theists in one of 3 ways. First, that it's true. Second, that it's useful. And third, that atheism fails in some important way. Well, I contend that the proposition God exists is presented in one of those same 3 ways. Now, Sam also pointed out, and I think rightly so, that the first approach is actually rarely attempted. In fact, as a fan of Cornelius Van Til and Van Til's presuppositional approach, I suspect Jon will rely almost exclusively on the third approach. So why is this important? Because by establishing that there are limits to human knowledge, which is actually quite trivial, Jon hopes to create conceptual space in which he hopes to park his notion of God. Now, some of you may recognize this is the God of the gaps argument, otherwise known as the argument from ignorance. The problem with this approach, however, is that even if Jon is remarkably successful, it doesn't actually get him to the position of establishing that the proposition God exists is true. This is because Jon is defending the positive assertion that God exists, and thus he has the burden of proof. For my part, I have no obligation, except perhaps to demonstrate that Jon has not met his. In other words, I don't need to convince you that the proposition God exists is false, but only to show that it is unreasonable to conclude that it's true. Now, if this sounds like some kind of philosophical doublespeak, then let me give you an actual example. If you're a juror on a criminal trial, once you've heard all the evidence and had a chance to deliberate, you're asked to present a finding of guilty or innocence, right?
No.
Wrong. That's not true. You're not asked for a finding of guilt or innocence, but rather you're asked to find the defendant guilty or not guilty. In other words, you're asked to determine whether the prosecution has met its burden in establishing the positive proposition that the defendant is guilty. The defendant in the courtroom has the presumption of innocence for precisely the same sound logical reasons as the proposition God exists has the presumption of being false until and unless there is compelling evidence to the contrary. In this sense, Jon does himself no favors in pursuing either tactic number 2, the utility of belief, or tactic number 3, the supposed problems of non-belief, but rather is obligated to present a positive account as to the truthfulness of the claim. Why then, if a straightforward positive account is required, do so few theists attempt it? Well, the short answer is, of course, because it doesn't work. But to be more precise, it doesn't work because in order to establish the truth of the claim, we need to establish at least 3 key elements. The first is we need a coherent definition of God. Literally, we need to know what we are talking about. The second, we need to know what it means to exist. Or to quote Bertrand Russell, to maintain that Hamlet exists in the world of Shakespeare's imagination, just as truly as Napoleon existed in the ordinary world, is to say something deliberately confusing. And we don't want to be confused. The third point, the third element, is that God must stand in some meaningful relationship to existence. But with respect to these requirements, Jon will not even get out of the starting gate. Now, theoretically, Jon could claim that God is reality itself. In fact, I believe that Cornelius Van Til, whose approach Jon echoes, was inadvertently making just that case. Quote, I hold that unless you believe in God, you can logically believe in nothing else. Well, this quote actually makes sense if you simply equate God with reality. If this was the claim, you'd have no argument from me. Reality exists by its very definition, and if you want to call it God, you'd simply switch the label on something we all agree on. So, great, we can all go home agreeing that God is reality and reality is God, and we agree to whatever label we use that exists. Well, I suppose not. I suspect Jon, as well as his fellow theists, would like something more than just to convince you that reality exists. They realize, however, that the traditional arguments fail to deliver. They fail to establish God as anything but a metaphor for reality. This is why many Christians have gravitated to presuppositionalism. Now, this is a school of thought. Again, I'll go back to Cornelius Van Til, credited to him, that says that Christians shouldn't use reason and evidence to argue for God's existence, but rather that God should be presupposed. Or, as Van Til notes, it's a circular argument that starts and ends with God, which, of course, is no more compelling than this bit of barroom humor I came across. Now, even Dr. Jason Lyle, who's also a presuppositionalist, states it in terms of having a foundation upon which everything else rests. What Dr. Lyle doesn't seem to come to grips with is that in order to comprehend God's Word, we need to assume the very aspects of reality that he is trying to justify. Now, what Dr. Lyle is doing is creating a circular argument that simply revolves around the same idea which Van Til alluded to, that everything starts and ends with reality. But again, this is not where the theist wants to end up. So Jon will argue for a specific Christian conception of God, something that exists in reality, yet is distinct from reality itself. Now this takes us back to our three requirements. But as you'll see, it won't be necessary to delve into the tricky question of existence, and it won't be necessary to address the issue of the relationship between God and existence. This is because Jon will not meet the very minimum requirement of providing a coherent definition of God. In other words, to use our courtroom analogy, we won't be in a position to start hearing evidence because the prosecution will not have even identified a defendant. So, what do we mean by a coherent definition? Well, we simply mean logically consistent. In other words, it can't contradict itself. Now, do we have any married bachelors in the room tonight? Any married bachelors, anybody? All right, well, if the question is confusing, don't feel bad. The very concept of a bachelor means to be unmarried. So you can't be both a bachelor and married at the same time by definition. So we can't exactly go looking for married bachelors because they can't, by definition, exist. But what about God? Do we have a coherent definition of God? Well, Jon teaches at the Veritas Academy, as Peggy mentioned, in Pennsylvania. And the Veritas website, it notes that they subscribe to specific statements of faith. Confessions of faith, I should call it. Now, each of these confessions tends to follow the previous in its doctrine, and they all reflect a type of reformed Christian theology. So I'm just going to work with the Philadelphia Confession. Besides, Jon lives right down the road from Philadelphia, so that seems to make sense. So here's the definition of God in the 3 paragraphs of chapter 2 of this confession. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to read the whole thing. But if you did read the whole thing, trust me, you'd find that not even Deepak Chopra could have used so many words to say so little. Now, every utterance is either expressed within a context that makes it devoid of meaning or is directly contradicted. Here, for example, incomprehensible, is the one word that you could use to summarize all 3 paragraphs. Now, to illustrate my point that God, at least as Jon envisions him, is incoherent, consider the definition of the word incomprehensible. Impossible to comprehend, unintelligible. So we have in the very definition of the thing that is being described, the admission that it is unintelligible. In short, God is defined as undefinable. This is not the road to coherence. And the common response to this is, of course, well, sure, there are some aspects of God we don't understand, but there are aspects that we do understand. Well, let's look at that section of the confession between the semicolons, because the semicolons denote independent clauses and can be taken on their own. Quote, who is immutable, immense, eternal, incomprehensible, almighty, every way infinite, most holy, most wise, most free, most absolute. There's no qualifier for God's incomprehensibility. So I take it that he's entirely incomprehensible. In fact, you could stick an and in where all these commas are, and it would still be grammatically correct, and you'd get something along the lines of, God is absolutely and infinitely in every way incomprehensible. So what's the point of defining it? But the incomprehensible admission is just one of the most obvious fatal flaws of this definition. We also have forgiving iniquity versus will by no means clear the guilty. Well, how is it possible to be forgiving without by some means clearing someone of their guilt? Or how about everybody's favorite, the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit of one substance, power, and eternity, having each having the whole divine essence, yet the essence undivided. What does it mean, for example, to have substance and yet be immaterial? Or for there to be three whole essences, yet one essence undivided? Even for there to be a father and son, yet to have no causal relationship between the two. This only makes sense metaphorically, not literally. Now, even John's fellow presuppositionalist, Cy ten Broeckingate, wrote, quote, "There are some characteristics of God that are beyond our ability to comprehend. For instance, God is one divine being in three distinct persons. Yet, they are so invested in the idea, they claim with absolute certainty that which they are unable to comprehend." Or, consider, is alone in and unto himself all-sufficient, not standing in need of any creature. Well, tell me, how is it that you could owe something such that the recipient could not gain from getting it? Why would humans be threatened with eternal torture or bribed with heavenly bliss to give our most precious gift, a gift of total obedience, if that gift has no value to God? It's because God is not unto himself all-sufficient. For God to exist, even in our imaginations, requires our total obedience to the doctrine that proclaims his existence. Clearly, it is belief in God that exists in reality, and not God himself. Now, indulge me for a second if you would. Just quickly close your eyes. Trust me on this. And imagine, we'll go back to the previous concept, imagine a married bachelor. Have an image? Okay, open your eyes. Now I bet most of you had a picture maybe of just a generic man in your head. Okay? If you're a little bit more imaginative, maybe you've thought of, I don't know, Brad Pitt. If you were my wife, you'd be thinking about Antonio Banderas. What can I say? I know my wife. But how could you have imagined a married bachelor? Something that can't possibly exist. Well, easy. You simply defaulted to the part of the concept that does exist, a man, and ignored the contradiction, and focused on the part that you could latch onto. The idea of God is no different. Now, we know what a father is, and we know what a son is. We know that God isn't a physical man like our father, and he doesn't come from genetic combination like our sons. But that doesn't mean that you can't take the idea of a father or a son, strip it of all relevance to the real world, and apply it to the word God. You're simply saying that reality is in some incomprehensible sense father-like or son-like. Now, it's completely understandable that we would try to relate to nature the same way we relate to each other. We live in social groups, and we've evolved sophisticated means to communicate, including the ability to predict what other people are thinking. It's called theory of mind, which children start expressing at about the age of 4 or 5. And it suggests that as a consequence of having large brains and advanced language, we can, to a degree, determine the intent of others. Now, this can be very helpful. For example, say a used car salesman is going to tell you what a great deal you're going to get on a car. You realize that his intent is not the same as your intent, and you can protect yourself. But what happens when this finely tuned sense of intention is carried over to nature itself, which has no intention? We have a hard time separating the intent of our fellow human beings from the intentionalist world at large. It's even more difficult when that world at large, reality, is wrapped up in the very notion of a father or son. Now, Michael Shermer, in his book, The Believing Brain, talks about our inclination to make false positives, or type 1 errors. It's the error of assuming an intent where none exists. Now, the advantage of being able to predict intent in other people, or predators for that matter, is obvious. While the assigning of intent to those things with no intention, like the weather, has a comparatively little cost. So over the long term, we're much more inclined to assign intent where it doesn't belong and make lots of type 1 errors along the way. Here's another example. Anybody here familiar with Moodus, Connecticut? Ever heard of it? This is where unexplained noises have been emanating from the ground for thousands of years. The noises are described as anything from belches to rolling thunder. The Algonquin Indians attributed the noises to their god Hobomoku, who was said to be scaring off evil spirits. Now, the early European settlers said it was either Satan or alternately their god making these noises. Of course, we know better now, but when confronted with a mystery, man is inclined to imbue the mystery with some intent. By the way, those noises in Modus, they're earthquakes very close to the surface of the ground. And the geology allows it to actually create some noise at the surface. Not Hobomoku. So to summarize my position, when it comes to God, we need to ask both the what question, but also the why question. The why question is, why have so many believed for so long? And that is exactly what social science and neuroscience are unraveling. What they found is to say that God exists is nothing more than to say that we see reality through God-colored glasses. And the what question, what is God, is that God is simply a metaphor for reality. Now, if John wants to claim more than that, then again, he has the three criteria that he needs to meet. A coherent definition of God, what it means to exist in reality, and a positive link between God and existence in reality. But as I've shown, John's definition of God is entirely incoherent, and consequently the second questions will become moot. Thus, we can clearly say that in the manner that John proposes, God does not exist. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming to this debate. I apologize for my stuffy voice. My youngest son, Silas, got a cold conveniently on Tuesday, and I picked it up conveniently on Thursday, and I'm just coming down conveniently on Saturday. So that's okay. God is still good. So we will roll with the punches. I want to thank RIT Skeptics for sponsoring tonight's debate. It's truly an honor to be here. I want to thank Dan, not only for agreeing to debate me and having, I think, a very cordial and edifying dialogue, but also he bought me dinner before the debate. And I'm all for free dinners, so this alone was worth it. Okay, the topic, as you heard, is does God exist? And the argument I'm going to use, contrary to what Dan said about most Christians going to this argument, actually, I would say very few Christians go to this argument when looked at the grand scheme of things. So I think it's unique in that you probably haven't heard of it before. So I ask that you be patient and think through the content and the form of the argument. Because if the argument is true, if it's correct, then I think it will show with certainty, not with probability, but with certainty, that the biblical God exists. And that alone should cause your ears to perk up a little bit. Now, just because I think I can show with certainty that the biblical God exists, it does not mean you will be convinced or persuaded by this argument. Okay, proof and persuasion are different, so naturally I'm sure I won't convert everyone in the audience, although I do have water for baptism afterwards, if you feel so inclined. But I'm sure I will not convert everyone, but that is in no way shows a detriment to my argument. Okay, now before we get to this argument, we need to define some terms. When I talk about God, I'm not talking about a generic God. I'm talking about the Christian God of the Bible. Okay, one God in three persons: Father, Son, Holy Spirit, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, creator, savior of the world, unchanging, the God of the Bible. Okay, I'm defending a specific God, the Christian God. Second is the word transcendental. Okay, when I speak about transcendentals tonight, I'm talking about the preconditions of knowledge. Okay, these are things that need to be the case, that need to hold for us to make intelligible our experience. Notice these are distinct from the word transcendent, okay, which means beyond human experience. So as I will argue tonight, God is transcendent of creation. He's also immanent, by the way, but he's transcendent of creation. And he also needs to be our ultimate transcendental for us to have knowledge and make our experience intelligible. So those are different. And lastly is the word arbitrary. Kant used this to refer to an argument that is unfounded, or, as I will argue, without good reason. Now, and Dan would agree with this, that And when we are in a debate, it is not acceptable to be arbitrary, okay, to give up a good reason for your position, because obviously you'd have no point to express your position. Okay, so we're obviously in agreement in that. But that word will be used tonight, so I just wanted to make sure you understand it. Okay, so those are the terms. Now we also need to talk about these preconditions. Okay, again, these are the things that transcendentally or preconditions to our knowledge need to have to make sense of our experience. For example, perception. We assume and we need our perceptions to be generally reliable. Now, of course, if they weren't generally reliable, then you couldn't consistently discern a true perception from a false perception in any kind of consistent way. You'd only accidentally get to true perceptions. It would undermine our knowledge. Same would go with memory. We need our memory to be generally reliable. Okay, if it wasn't generally reliable, then you couldn't trust that what you knew in the past actually was that way. So simple tasks like reading a sentence from a book couldn't actually be intelligible. You'd have to constantly be wondering if what you remembered was correct. If it wasn't generally reliable, it would undermine our knowledge. Third, the uniformity of nature. Okay, we assume and we need tomorrow to be like today. Okay, of course, if we don't know it's that way, or if it actually isn't that way, then we couldn't rely upon what we knew in the past to be the case in the future. Okay, you'd have to constantly be testing everything you claim to know, and that would never end. Okay, which would undermine your knowledge. Fourth, your own existence. Obviously, if you don't exist, there's no point saying that you're the one doing the knowing. Pretty obvious. And lastly, the law of non-contradiction. Okay, you cannot have A and not A at the same time in the same way. You can't have contradictions be true. If contradiction could be true, then there'd be no way to discern truth from error. And so obviously would undermine your knowledge. Okay, now there are other transcendentals and preconditions like this, but I want to just get you an idea of you need all of these for knowledge. Not just one or two, but all of them to make sense of your experience. And you can't affirm one or two of them without affirming the other. Okay, they're interconnected. Okay, so those are the terms. These are the preconditions. Now let's get to this transcendental argument for God's existence. It reads as follows. For it to be the case that we have knowledge and experience, it must be the case that we know these preconditions hold. Okay, we actually have to know the world is the way we assume it to be. Okay? And it'll be my contention tonight that for it to be the case that we know the world is the way we need it to be in these preconditions, it must be the case that Christianity is true. Now, if you deny that, which people are welcome to do that, you deny that, then obviously you put your own experience as a standard for your knowledge. And I will argue tonight that when you do that, it will undermine your ability to know the world is this way. If it undermines it down here, it undermines it up there. If it undermines it up there, then logically it would undermine all of your knowledge and experience, because that's a precondition for you to have knowledge in this world. So, how do we prove the biblical God transcendentally from the impossibility of the contrary? Okay, if he wasn't God and wasn't who he says he is, then you couldn't make sense of anything in your experience, including the very questioning of his existence. Okay, now that sounds all well and good, but how do you actually demonstrate such an argument? Well, you demonstrate it with a positive case and a negative case. And the distinction here is very important. This isn't just a deductive argument. It's that we knock down the atheist and we say, Christianity is true. Okay, it's not that kind of argument. That would be fallacious, obviously. We have a positive case first and then a negative case. And the positive case, very simply, is the Christian can justify that the world is actually the way we need it to be. Not only do we know that as Christians, but unbelievers know that as well and will function based on having that knowledge. God, who made everyone, reveals that to us in special revelation in the Bible, but also in general revelation in your conscience of being made in his image and by common grace. So even people who haven't read the Bible will know these things by God's grace. Okay, so people do know these things. And because God is perfect and logical and unchanging and the creator and sustainer of the world, we can trust what he says. Okay, so now this justification is coherent. There's no contradiction in these attributes of God. We've have seen none of that demonstrated yet tonight. And actually what's interesting in this is that there's no neutrality in this position. Christ said you're either for him or you're against him. So even if you claim neutrality, you would be denying Christ's denial of neutrality. So interestingly, in this positive case, we see only one other option, and that's the non-Christian position. And so what we do to illustrate the positive case is we go to the negative case. This is where we do an internal critique of the non-Christian position. There are varieties of this, like naturalism or atheism tonight, pantheism, polytheism, deism, and a whole host of others. And it'll be my contention that all of these ultimately will be reduced to a problem. And that is that because they reject the biblical God, the standard of their knowledge will be grounded in their experience. And because of that, they will be reduced either to self-contradiction or complete arbitrariness at the foundation of their position, having no good reason, complete ignorance that the world is actually the way you assume and you need it to be. They'll have no justification for it being the way they need it to be. So we will illustrate that tonight with atheism. But again, this could be done even with false theistic positions. Okay, and so we're going to go through three preconditions. One is perception, the second will be memory, and the third will be the uniformity of nature. So first, perception. Again, if we're going to justify this from our experience, okay, we need to provide some kind of justification. Now, we assume this is reality. Okay? We assume most of our perceptions are generally reliable. Most are true, a couple are false. And you probably experienced this. I was going to Veritas a couple of months ago, and I could have sworn that our kindergarten teacher was behind me. Okay? And then I did some further work and different angle and lighting, and I realized this person looked nothing like our kindergarten teacher. Okay, I was in error in that perception. 2 weeks prior to that, I could have sworn there was this face in the back of this van as I was driving to school. It was very odd. It was disturbing. So I drove closer and did all this further investigation and realized they were just cords that were wrapped around a hook. Okay, of course, I was in error. Now I assume those are rare, okay, in my experience. But I haven't done the work to test that they actually are rare. I just assume it. Now, and you do as well. And there are people who have even stronger errors than this. Some people who have a deceased spouse will see that spouse and other people sometimes years later. And sometimes we'll see them as hallucinations walking around. Okay, great errors in their perceptions. Now notice, we all assume this is rare, these are oddities. But do we know that's the case? Do we have any good reason that that's the case beyond just we assume it's that way? There are people in this world who are chronic hallucinators, who even beyond that would be insane or have some kind of other, we would say, defect in their perceptions. But they just as axiomatically, okay, or as a pre-commitment, believe that this is reality. But we would say this is reality for them. Okay, we both strongly believe that most of our perceptions are generally reliable, but their assumption is false. Absolutely false. Now notice, it's not that they have all false perceptions, it's just they have so many false perceptions it undermines their ability to know consistently the true perception from the false perception. So notice, they think this is a true perception, which it is. But they also just as strongly think that's a true perception, that's a true perception, and that's a true perception, and on it goes. And so what's interesting is that because there's so much falsity in their perceptions, it undermines their ability to know things from their experience. They only accidentally stumble upon true perceptions. Now, when you look at this, it's not enough to say, well, we assume it's this way. We assume that this isn't our reality. Well, of course we do. Yes, of course, that's a basic pre-commitment to our functioning. But just because we assume it's that way does not logically follow it is that way. Okay, you need some kind of justification, some kind of good reason that you can know the world is this way. As a Christian, I have that. I don't think atheists do. Now, you could try to test this from your experience. And you could devise some test. But think about it. No matter what test you devise, okay, you could always have further revelation, further knowledge shown that would undermine your test. What you thought was really a sufficient test wasn't a sufficient test. Now, even if you could have a test that was somehow reliable, if you ever picked out a perception, which we don't do this, by the way, but let's say you did, you actually went out and tested the specific perception. That's a chair, and I'm going to test that until I'm very confident it's a chair. You have tens, if not hundreds, of other perceptions going on that you're not testing. And so how from your experience could you test and confirm possibly that generally your perceptions are reliable? I don't think it's possible from your experience. And yet as an atheist, that's where you are. As a Christian, I have an answer for this because I don't appeal to my experience to justify this. Second would be memory. The same thing with your perceptions. We see people who just as fundamentally assume that their perceptions are generally reliable, but they're not. These are false assumptions. Okay, but they hold them just as strongly as we do, and they would debate with us that our memories are in error over against theirs. And so how do we justify that ours are actually reliable, generally, and theirs are not? Just assuming it's the case is not sufficient. And lastly, the uniformity of nature. Will tomorrow be like today? You have a ball. You let it go. It will drop. Now, you do that 5 seconds from now, will it drop again? We assume it will, okay, because we have to assume the uniformity of nature, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's nothing logically impossible or contradictory about nature behaving differently 5 seconds from now. Both are possibilities. So what good reason from your experience do you have that it actually will be that way? I think the atheist is complete ignorance on that point. Has no good reason for that the future will actually be like the past. And the mere case that you assume it's that way is irrelevant to it actually being that way. You need some kind of good reason for that. Now, some people who actually try to answer this is they will almost always appeal to past experience. They'll say, well, hey, we know the future will be like the past because the past behaved a certain way. Of course, that is begging the question, is not relevant to actually what's being argued, and that is, how do you know the future will behave like the past? Meaning that there is a relationship between the future and the past. We're not asking how the past behaved, we're asking how you know the future will behave like the past. How do you justify that from your experience? There needs to be a reason for that. And notice, even if you could use past experience, which I don't think you logically can, but let's say you could, how much of the universe have you experienced? How much has humanity at large, in the history of humanity, experienced of the universe? An extremely small amount, extremely small amount. If I said 1 in a trillion, that would be very generous. And so what that argument would be, in essence, saying is that from a 1 in a trillion observations, we saw the universe was uniform, and therefore the whole universe is going to be uniform on into the future. Extremely weak statistical argument, and yet that's all you have as an atheist given your experience. So again, I think it can be shown that the force now, the transcendental argument, for it to be the case that we have knowledge and experience, it needs to be the case that Christianity is true. You have two options in this argument. You can deny knowledge, which of course is self-refuting, you have to affirm knowledge to deny it, or you can deny Christianity. But as a result, when you do that, you will have to justify your knowledge completely from your experience. And I think, as has been shown, you'll be reduced to complete ignorance at the foundation of your position. And because your position, the foundation, everything built upon that, even the success of modern science or understanding what I'm saying right now, going home in your car, and all the rest, all the things we have in our experience and knowledge, is built upon these assumptions. If you're completely ignorant to what the reality of the world actually is, meaning you have no good reason for it being reliable or unreliable, uniform or not uniform, then you have no good reason with everything that's built upon that. Okay, complete ignorance, all the way up. Now you say, well, wait a minute, but atheists have knowledge, right? They make computers and they buy dinners for Christians and they do all these great things. They write books, and Dan's written a book. They do wonderful things. They can make PowerPoints. Absolutely. Absolutely. Atheists can do wonderful things, and they do many good things, and I like conversing with atheists because they have knowledge in this world. But they only have that knowledge because they're being inconsistent with their ignorance at their foundation. They're being inconsistent with their position. They have to be inconsistent with their position to make sense of the world, which is the whole point of the argument. Okay, they have to borrow from the Christian God to function and have knowledge in this world. And you can't get away from it. Okay, God made you in such a way that you're going to know him and you're going to function in a way according to how he revealed the world is to you. And so every thought, every action, every instance of your life, each one of your lives testifies to his existence, and you can't get away from it. So, does God exist? Well, the answer is obvious. You couldn't even understand that question if he didn't. Thank you.
My book is such a great thing after you read it. Okay, so this is my, just so you know what we're doing, this is my 10-minute first rebuttal. Actually, I was pleasantly surprised that Jon actually listed a number of things that he and I completely agree on, and that is the preconditions of knowledge. If I got this correctly, sense perception, that are at least provisionally valid, memory, uniformity of nature, our existence, and the law of non-contradiction, for example. I agree, those are preconditions for knowledge. But then what he says is that we need to know these. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to put his God, essentially leapfrog in front of the preconditions for knowledge to be a precondition for knowledge. And that doesn't work. The other issue was that he claims absolute certainty for this particular view. Now this, he's not talking about certainty in the sense of having a strong conviction, he's talking about a logical certainty. Now in that sense we need to talk about the difference between a deductive and an inductive argument. What an inductive argument does is take specific instances, empirical evidence for example, and draw a larger conclusion. So for example, I could drop my pen over and over again, and I could say, okay, from those specific instances, I'm going to draw the conclusion of the larger argument that gravity exists, and that gravity is uniform throughout the universe and so forth. So that's an inductive argument, specific instances to a greater conclusion. A deductive argument, on the other hand, takes a general argument and gives specific examples. For example, the classic example of a deductive argument is all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. If the first two premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. And that would be a logically certain conclusion given the truthfulness of the premises. Now, where I'm going with this is that when Jon says that his argument is logically certain, what he's doing is he creates a false dichotomy between the Christian view and the non-Christian view. And what he says is if the non-Christian view is false, his view must win by default. The problem with that argument, actually Brian Goss, who's a Christian, who's written about this particular argument, points out that embedded in that idea of the non-Christian view being false is an inductive argument which is inherently uncertain. What Jon is doing is he's saying everything that's not his view is one argument. And he's saying that that's all, if you read Greg Bahnsen, who's a practitioner of, he's deceased now, but was a practitioner of presuppositionalism, he'll say that it all comes down to human autonomy or the Christian worldview. The problem is that there are worldviews that don't exist yet, that have yet to be developed. Or there are worldviews that Jon or other presuppositionalists have not evaluated. Not only that, the ones that they have evaluated, they've actually gotten wrong. So what he's doing is he's taking specific examples of his conclusion that, for example, atheism is wrong, and drawing a broader conclusion that therefore his argument must be right. That's an inductive argument, and inductive argument is by its very nature uncertain. Okay, the other thing that he points to, really the core of his argument, has to do with the uniformity of nature. And this is actually one of my favorite arguments. used by the presuppositionalist because, well, let me just read a quote, again, by Dr. Greg Monson. He said, God created the world, and the world reflects the uniformity that he, talking about God, imposes on it by his governing. And our thinking is to reflect the consistency and logical coherence that is in God's thinking. Here's the problem with this. John has already told us that uniformity is a precondition for knowledge. It must be assumed. How is it then that God is imposing uniformity on nature if we've already assumed uniformity? Again, he's trying to leapfrog God in front of the thing that he's already assuming. The other problem with that is it's called special pleading in the sense that he's going to claim, or has claimed, that the universe requires this uniformity to be imposed on it. And he talked about if the universe is non-uniform, that we can't be sure that what happens today is going to happen tomorrow. But think about this for a minute. Physics students may get a better grasp on this, or math majors, for example. But think about what would it mean for the universe to be non-uniform? Well, it means everything that we know about the universe, the strong force, the weak force, electromagnetic, gravity, could be infinitely large or infinitely negative or zero for any length of time or no length of time at all. Can we even conceive of such a universe? My answer is no. It's incoherent. And it's incoherent, therefore, we assume that the universe is uniform because of the impossibility of the contrary. John wants to tell us, well, we have two choices, and the universe's natural condition is non-uniformity, therefore God must impose uniformity upon it. No, non-uniformity isn't even a coherent idea. That's why we assume that the universe is uniform. Now, he goes into the transcendental argument a little bit. TAG, as it's called, Transcendental Argument for God, is an interesting argument. It essentially, although he didn't get into the laws of logic, it's most often described in terms of the laws of logic are the product, or more sophisticated arguments are it is a reflection of God. Again, it's the same problem the uniformity of nature argument has. If we're going to argue that logic needs a source, what we're doing is we're making a descriptive versus prescriptive error. By the way, how much time do I have? Okay, thanks. We're making a prescriptive versus descriptive error. And what that means is when we say that the universe operates in a logical manner, we're describing it. Okay? We're saying, in essence, that logic reflects the nature of the universe. But what the tag argument tries to assert is the same thing with uniformity, that logic needs to be imposed upon the universe. So, if the universe needs to have logic imposed upon it, then what is it that's going to impose it? Well, he's going to say God. Well, then it begs the question, is God uniform? Well, if God is uniform, then why is it that we can assume that God is uniform, but not the universe is uniform? It's called special pleading. Actually, Saitem Bruggencke calls it the taxicab fallacy. To say that the universe needs to have logic imposed upon it sounds really good for a while. You know, you take the cab as long as it's useful, but when you get to the point where you see that, well, now you need to apply this to God, it's not working out so well, so we're going to jump out of the taxicab. Okay? It's blatant special pleading. Why would we assume that for God and not be able to assume it for the universe? It also violates what's called the law of parsimony, or Occam's razor, which says we take the simplest answer. The simplest answer is that's a reflection of the way the universe is. Also, just regarding the way that we create models of the universe, John is saying that we need to have absolute certainty about, for example, the uniformity of nature. Actually, Karl Popper, I think we forget whether he's German or Austrian philosopher, said that what we actually do is we create models in a pragmatic sense. And then if we find information that violates that model, we change the model to accommodate the new information. So we're constantly evolving new models. We don't have to be absolutely certain about the model. We just have to be open to new information. Okay. So I'm going to give a quick example of how this actually works in reality. Isaac Newton came up with the laws of motion. Force equals mass times acceleration. Worked great. You can shoot your cannonball at the right angle and hit the ship in the distance. Everybody was happy with that. Described the way motion objects work, move in the world, and so forth. Well, then along comes Einstein, and Einstein says, well, we're seeing some evidence that somehow this doesn't always apply. So that's when he came up with his theory of relativity, which explained this new information. He expanded the model. Well, then comes along quantum physics. Quantum physics says, well, at the really, really tiny levels, things are completely different than at the large-scale Einstein level of the cosmos. And now we've got this contradiction. And that's what physicists are working on today, to try to come up with a model in a pragmatic sense that envelops that new information. So we know, for example, our model is not certain because quantum physics disagrees with Einsteinian physics. Am I done? So I'm going to just wrap up. So we know we do it in a pragmatic sense. We don't need to be certain about it. Thanks.
Okay, a number of things I want to address in this. I won't hit everything, but see how we can do. He said it's a false dichotomy. It's basically an inductive argument. These are wrong, therefore this is right. Of course, that's a direct contradiction to my presentation, which gave a positive case, and then I think clearly showed that in the illustration of the positive case, I have a justification, I have a good reason that the world actually is this way, is the negative case, critiquing the non-Christian position. Again, Dan does this often, did this in our last debate, where he, apparently I don't think it's intentional, ignores what I say, and then crafts it into some kind of straw man and then knocks it down. Of course, this is not an inductive argument, and I showed that in my presentation. I have a positive case for my position. It's not just purely negative. He says that there could be new worldviews in the future. Yes, of course, but since logically they'd all have to be in the non-Christian position, because there's no neutrality, Christ did not leave that open for any position in the future, then they will all fall under the non-Christian position. And of course, if he wants to make up some new worldview beyond atheism in the future and defend that, he's welcome to that. He can renounce his atheism and have some other worldview. Okay, but if he doesn't have one, this is really just an appeal to ignorance. He says that to say we need to know the preconditions is to have a pre in the preconditions. That's just not possible. And actually, I think I've shown that it is possible. Because, yes, it's a precondition that we need to assume the world is this way, but logically, it doesn't follow the world has to be that way. Just because we assume it's that way doesn't mean it actually is that way. It's very possible there are people that assume their perceptions are generally reliable, their memory is generally reliable, but that assumption is false. Okay, just because you assume it, it doesn't logically follow it is that way. I have a good reason for why it is that way. Dan has clearly shown he does not have a good reason for that. It's an arbitrary assumption. Now, he says that there are only two arguments, deductive and inductive. Of course, I think this shows the ignorance to the actual presuppositional argument, which I hope he elaborates on in his book, and it's kind of important. And that is that there's actually a third form of argumentation, that's transcendental argumentation. For example, law of logic, like law of non-contradiction. You don't prove that deductively. Okay, you have to assume it before you even start your deduction. It's a transcendental. Okay, so to show those things, you show them from the possibility of the contrary. To even make sense of this world, we have to already presuppose the laws of logic. Okay, so this is a different argument. I think the form that I showed in the presentation illustrated that. For it to be the case that we have knowledge and experience, it must be the case that Christianity is true. That's a transcendental argument, not a deductive and not an inductive argument. Now, he says that it's a circular argument. Well, of course it is. All transcendentals, you have to use them, okay, to justify them. I assume my perceptions are generally reliable when I gave my argument tonight, but it was not viciously circular in the sense of I didn't say, well, my perceptions are generally reliable because they're generally reliable. That would be a viciously circular argument. The justification does not go beyond the very thing I'm trying to prove. But my argument does go beyond the very thing I'm trying to prove. It's not a viciously circular argument. It is a spirally circular argument, which is very different. Okay, I have a good reason for why we actually know the world is the way it is. And I don't start from my experience ultimately as a justification for that. I start with God, who knows these things and can be trusted, and he revealed those to us. And that's a coherent, consistent justification. I have a good reason. Atheists do not. He says that it's an incomprehensible definition of God. I saw no reason why any of that is incomprehensible. He used the definition of unintelligible, which Christians would not adhere to, that God is so completely beyond the creation that we can't know anything about him. Of course, that's not what we mean by incomprehensible. We mean he's not fully comprehended. You can never exhaust the knowledge of God or exhaust his power. Can we know some things about God? Yes, of course. In some lower sense, we can comprehend God, but not fully comprehend him. We can never get to the end of who God is ultimately, okay, in full comprehension. I think that's pretty straightforward from the creeds. Again, I see a lot of gripes about the Trinity, one God and three persons. Of course, there's in no way is that contradictory. Never has been shown to be contradictory by Dan. He just simply doesn't like these descriptions of God. He talks about God being forgiving yet unforgiving. No, God is very forgiving. Okay, he forgives people. You repent of your sins, God forgives you. Okay, he is overly gracious with us. I mean, his common grace in this world, the fact that he gives us sunshine and rain and crops and the ability to enjoy great movies like Pixar movies and the other good things, like even The Winter Soldier, which I thought was a great movie. He gives these things to atheists and non-Christians alike. God is good to creation. Okay, he's forgiving. Every second of our lives he's forgiving. Okay, but if you reject him and you don't want to live with him, then he will ultimately give you what you want. You will live in eternity without him, which is what you wanted anyways. Okay, but yes, in that sense he'd be unforgiving. This is in no way contradictory. We see no reason why it is. He says that, why can't we just say the universe is uniform instead of having to say God is uniform? This goes back to his equating God with reality. Of course, this is false. I'm not just equating God with a reality. Reality does not tell you, this is the whole point of the critique, reality doesn't tell you whether your perceptions are generally reliable, whether nature is uniform. Nature doesn't speak to you and tell you those things. You can't equate God, a reality with God, because God can speak to you and has done so, both in verbal form and written and also in your conscience. Reality doesn't do that. You cannot logically equate one with the other. And so yes, you assume nature is uniform, but that assumption does not tell you if it actually is. God, who is uniform, tells us it is. Okay, those are very different. That's not the same thing. I'm not just equating one with the other. He says again, and this is an argument from ignorance, it's a God of the gaps. This is not the case at all. This is that you have ignorance at the very foundation of your position. At the very preconditions of your knowledge of things that you need to hold in this world. You have no idea the world's actually this way. You have no good reason, no positive case for your position being true in this area. No positive case. No good reason. And because of that, you have ignorance then all the way up. This isn't just an individual ignorance like you don't know where life began or something. You don't know why we have rain, something like that you could fill possibly with science. This is a ignorance at the very foundation of all of your knowledge. This is not a traditional God of the gaps argument. He says that nature naturally is not uniform given the Christian position, and God imposes uniformity on it. That's actually the opposite of what presuppositionalists would say. That is that God made the world inherently uniform. In no case was it not uniform. Okay, but we can't know it's uniform epistemologically unless something outside of our experience, i.e. God, tells us it's uniform for our justification. So yes, God sustains the world, obviously, keeps you alive and keeps the creation moving, okay, but it is inherently uniform. I don't deny that at all. He says we cannot conceive of a universe that is not uniform. I deny that that's true. You can conceive of gravity being completely different 5 seconds from now, or the strong and weak nuclear forces being different 5 seconds from now. There's nothing illogical or contradictory about that. David Hume spent years on this problem. And philosophers, hundreds of them since him, have spent years on this problem. Okay, it is not impossible that the universe is not uniform at all. It is entirely possible. at 5 seconds from nature is different. Do you have a good reason that it actually will be that way? I know you assume it, but it's a blind leap of faith. You have no good reason it will be that way. I have a reason as a Christian. So this is not the same thing as a law of non-contradiction, because I think that a universe without the law of non-contradiction is a contradiction. Because it has to first be a universe. It couldn't be A and not A at the same time in the same way. Existence implies that. Okay, so, but to equate the uniformity of nature and the law of non-contradiction as being the same transcendentally would be an error. Okay, because we can imagine a world that is not uniform. We cannot, I don't think we can imagine a world that isn't, that the law of non-contradiction doesn't hold in it. So that's an error by Dan in that. And so it's interesting to see that normally it's the Christian that has a claim that has the blind leap of faith. We have no good reason for our position. And what we see tonight is actually the opposite. It's the Christian who's trying to be rational. The Christian who's trying to say, hey, we want to have a reason in our position. Let's actually provide a justification. We have one. What we see tonight is Dan does not. The atheist position has no justification. The world is actually the way he needs it to be. Both are possibilities. He has no good reason for that. And does he still know things? Of course he does, because he acts contrary to this position, which is, again, an illustration of the positive case. To know things in this world, you have to borrow from the biblical God. Thank you.
So let's keep going. I just want to clarify one thing. I think a few minutes ago, and I don't know if it was if you misspoke or not, but you said that God is outside of our experience.
God transcends our experience, and he also is immanent in our experience.
Okay. So you are saying that God is outside of our experience.
Yes.
Okay.
And he's also in our experience.
Okay.
He transcends the creation. Okay, he's outside of it. He created it. He existed prior to the creation. So he transcends it. But he's also present everywhere. You can't get anywhere where he's not there.
Gotcha. Okay. I'm going to ask about original sin. Now, this might seem like an odd thing because we're talking about the existence of God and a specific doctrine, but I want to kind of get at the why question that I opened up with initially. So, just briefly, can you tell me what your understanding of original sin is?
Sure. Adam and Eve were created perfect at the garden, and the creation itself was perfect. There was no moral defect in it. It was good. It was very good, as God said in Genesis 1:31. And the first sin was, because Adam was the headship of creation, Eve sinned, and then he actually sinned, which brought sin and death into the world. And because of that, humanity itself are sinners, and all of the offspring from Adam and Eve are inherently born sinful. They reject God from conception.
Okay. Are you familiar with Dr. James Anderson's work called Calvinism and the First Sin?
I'm not.
Okay. He's his main mission in that particular work. He's from a Reformed theology think tank, essentially in Charlotte, North Carolina. But his mission was to attempt to assign moral culpability for Adam eating the apple. But my question is, why are we morally culpable for that particular quote-unquote sin?
Well, you're morally culpable for the actions that you commit in this world. So it's not just that you go to hell because of original sin. You go to hell because you don't like God, and you don't desire to follow him at any point in your life. So you don't, it's not that Dan Courtney is a great guy in God's eyes in the sense of morally he's perfect. It's just that Adam messed up, and so I'm sorry, Dan, it's too bad for you. It's that, Dan, you like the freedom that Adam gave you in his rebellion, and you feast on that, you live on that to reject God. And it's because of that sin, the rebellion, that God then sends you to hell. Of course, you can be forgiven of that. You don't have to work it off or do Christ. That's why Christ died on the cross for our sins.
So
Are people hearing okay?
Yeah.
So let me just repeat my question. So you're saying that I am morally culpable for Adam's sin. I'm not sure if I understand that correctly.
I guess, what do you mean morally culpable? Like, you would only go to hell because Adam sinned?
You said, I'm sorry, Adam rejected God's command or whatever, therefore I don't know how else to put it, I'm culpable, I'm responsible in God's eyes, as it were, and I'm going to get sent to hell because of what he did.
Well, Adam was the head of creation. His decisions affected not only humanity, but also the animals, I would argue, that they were negatively affected by this as well. So because he was the head of creation, others were affected by his decision. Now, yes, you in that sense are negatively affected because you're born sinful, but you don't have to keep following your sin. You're welcome to turn to God at any point in your life and he'll forgive you. So I don't see how that's a bad deal.
Well, let's say on your drive home this evening, and I'm sorry you have to drive home late tonight, but on your drive home this evening, let's say that you're daydreaming or whatever, thinking about what you should have said in the debate, and you end up going a little bit too fast, and you get a speeding ticket. If you do that, should we come to your house and imprison your children for your speeding?
I don't follow that analogy at all.
Well, the question is, should we hold your children responsible for what you did?
Because I sped.
Well, whatever transgression you committed, I'm just using speeding as a common example. Should we hold your children responsible for an action that you undertook?
Of course, we do that when, like, if I go into debt and my wife is then liable because she's with me. Something like in that sense, if I go into debt and I die and she's liable for that debt, that's immoral.
Well, you also have a legal contract with her called marriage, but
I'm talking about people, and covenantally, parents have a legal contract with their children.
Gotcha.
Okay, with God, obviously, legally. So children bear, what their parents did, negatively and positively. But at any point, those children could turn and be forgiven. So I would hope in your scenario, if the child said, well, forgive me, I didn't want my dad to speed, if you would forgive him, or society would forgive him, that would be an analogous situation.
Gotcha. Okay, it's time to switch up. So.
Okay, Dan, I heard a lot of you talking about the uniformity of nature and how we need to assume it, and of course, I agree with that. Do you have any good reason that tomorrow will be like today?
Well, if it was different than today, then I would expect there to be a reason that it's different. Any specific attribute, let's talk gravity, because that's a simple thing. If gravity is a description of the way matter interacts, then if gravity was different tomorrow, we would have a different description of how matter interacts. In other words, there would have to be a reason why matter would be interacting differently, something that we didn't understand. So in that sense, we expect gravity to be the same tomorrow because that's currently our best model of how matter interacts, of what reality is.
Well, of course, if gravity acted differently, we would try to test, how we knew what changed, of course.
Sure.
But that doesn't answer my question. I'm asking, do you know that tomorrow will be like today? I know you assume it, okay, and I know you function based on that assumption. And David Hume, pointed out as an agent, he's like, of course, I function this way. But as a philosopher, I actually want like a justification or some kind of argument for why it would be that way. It escapes me.
Sure. Well,
do you have a good reason for it will be that way?
Well, and as I mentioned, Karl Popper took on specifically Hume's quote-unquote problem of induction argument and explained how we're actually creating models of reality. And we're in that model, we test empirical evidence against that model to see if it fits. Now, for all of human history, gravity has fit that particular model. So
are you, so we get to the bottom of this, are you then appealing then to past experience to justify the future? The future will be this way.
There's no question, it's an inductive argument.
Okay.
If I sit in a chair, for example, and it supports me, fortunately, if I come across another chair, I'm going to expect the chair is going to support me. Can I have absolute certainty of that? Well, of course not. But I'm taking specific instances, I'm making the inductive argument that it's going to continue.
Okay.
And if it doesn't continue, there must be a reason why.
Of course, I agree with that.
Sure.
Bertrand Russell made the clarification, this is now almost 150 plus years after Hume, in his book, The Problems of Philosophy. Bertrand Russell was no Christian. He was probably the greatest atheist philosophers that's probably ever existed. And he said that the clarification, and he doesn't have an answer for this. Okay? He, yes, of course, agrees that we use past experience to justify the future, but he made this distinction. He said, there are past futures and future futures. We're asking how you know future futures will behave a certain way. To appeal to past futures is irrelevant to how we know the future futures will be this way. So what good reason do you have that the future futures will be this way?
Well, I'll be perfectly honest, you lost me. It's been some time since I did read that book.
I was going to draw it on the board.
There's a marker behind the screen that's attached to the podium.
Okay,
But
there are past futures. Okay, there's futures that have already happened in the past, operated a certain way. Okay, we're asking how you know future futures will behave like past futures. It's talking about the relationship between the future and the past. Of course, at Karl Popper, you make models and how they acted in the past. That's not the question. The question is how you know the future will be like your models.
But that's the whole idea of a model, is to make a projection into the future.
Of course, Dan, but if you don't know, the future is going to be like the past, which I'm not hearing an answer to that question.
Well, when you say no, you're implicitly requiring an absolute certainty, a logical certainty.
No, do you have any good reason? Like,
Yes.
this isn't just like absolute certainty. Do you have any good reason that the future will be like the past?
I'm making an inductive argument.
No, but see that you're talking about past futures, and that's why Russell made the clarification. We're talking about future futures.
So you're saying that we can never come to a conclusion based upon an inductive argument?
Oh, absolutely not. No, we can, but it's because, though, we borrow from God and know that nature actually is uniform. He made a world that's reliable and won't randomly change 5 seconds from now. We rely upon that knowledge as unbelievers and believers to then use inductive arguments to make sense of our world. I love science. Of course we use that in science, but I'm saying epistemologically, given your starting point, you have no good reason for that assumption, which then should undermine everything that's built upon that. So lastly, we're almost done. Do you have a good reason that the future futures will behave like past futures?
I honestly, I don't know what to tell you other than to say I'm using a perfectly valid inductive argument. The uniformity of nature that we are assuming is we get to it via an inductive argument, and it's part of our current model of reality. We're getting into a little bit of kind of deep philosophical stuff. And again, what John is talking about is what Hume described as the problem of induction. And I don't want to kind of beat a dead horse, but it really isn't a problem. Since Karl Popper told us that we are described, really, what we do in reality is make models of reality and then test against that, and those change over time as we get more information. I want to read, I just want to go back to the core tag argument really quickly. I had, make sure that I can find it here. I actually had a chance, oh gosh, where is that? Oh, here it is. I had a chance this past week. I don't know if you're familiar with Matt Slick. He's kind of, the tag argument guy, has it on his Christian Apologetics and Research Ministry website. And he uses this God as the source, or he says God reflects logic, and uses that particular argument. But he actually switched to a different argument in the last debate that I saw, and what's called the cosmological argument, that God is the cause of the universe that John has also alluded to. In this debate that Mr. Sir Reverend Slick had with a gentleman by the name of Eddie Tabash, he said, and I'll quote, he said, "If it exists before the universe in a timeless state, how can it do anything if it's timeless and changeless? It doesn't do anything. Something that is timeless and changeless doesn't do anything. It just sits there. How can it bring something into existence? It can't." So I had a chance this past week to call into his radio show, and I read that quote to him, and I said, "I'm not sure if you're talking about God or something other than God not being able to do anything." And he said, "Well, wait a minute. What I'm talking about is something other than God, and the reason that God, as a timeless, changeless entity, can bring can cause the universe is because he's personal. And I said, well, I don't quite understand how, whether he's personal or impersonal, you're still using the term cause, which can only be used in the context of having time, at the same time that you're saying that God is timeless. And he tried to divert me to, what are thoughts and all sorts of other stuff before I called him. It was the end of the show. I called him the next day and continued to challenge him, and he ultimately cut me off. But the point is that what happens repeatedly in trying to assert God as any other thing than reality itself is you end up in these blatant contradictions. If God is timeless, then you can't say that God caused the universe, because a cause is inherently a time-dependent notion. In fact, cosmologists understand today that to say that the universe was caused is itself incoherent, because time and space, or Einstein told us space-time, actually came into existence with the Big Bang. To say that there's a cause of the universe is inherently contradictory. But that's exactly what John wants us to try to imagine, if you would, is a cause outside the very context in which cause has meaning. Now, how much time do I have?
Over there.
Just over a minute. The other problem is, John kind of alluded to it at the beginning, what's called the pretended neutrality fallacy. And as I mentioned, he did start out at the very beginning explaining that we start from the same position. What he called a transcendental position is, I call them axioms, the starting points. And again, I'm kind of repeating myself, but I think this is really important, that yes, we must assume that those are the case. They are a part of our model of reality, as Karl Popper told us. And if we find something that's inconsistent with that, then we'll change our model of reality. In fact, that's what physicists are trying to do right now, is to take that quantum mechanics, which says you can't know the velocity and position of a subatomic particle at the same time, and rationalize that with Einstein's relativity. And we haven't got those two things together, so we're actually pretty sure that our current model of reality is not correct. But what is the new model that we're coming up with? And that's what the best minds in the world are working on at this point. So we can actually tell you right now that we're probably wrong about something really important, but we don't know what that is. So to say that we're absolutely certain about anything is really misguided. Thank you.
I think it's pretty evident that Dan has no response to how we can justify nature actually is uniform. Now notice, think of this very, very clearly, okay? Because this is a huge error he's making in this. And that is, if you have no good reason that nature actually will be uniform, of course you assume it will be, but do you have no good reason it actually will be, meaning you're ignorant to that, then you can't have induction. Because if you're truly ignorant to that, to be consistent with your ignorance, you'd have to continually test what you thought to be the case in the past, still applied in the future. You'd have to constantly test your ignorance. And so if you were consistent with that ignorance, which is evident he is ignorant at this point, then you could have induction. And so you can't justify the uniformity of nature purely by induction, which is the whole point of what Russell was clarifying with the past futures and future futures. And this is the whole point of the argument tonight, is that to live consistently with this ignorance, you'd have to become a vegetable. Okay? It's impossible to be consistent with ignorance at the very foundation of your position. Of course, atheists don't live consistently with that, and praise God for that. It's not because they're atheists that they do so. It's because God made them in His image, and they will function accordingly. Now, it's interesting that most of his cross-examination was spent on something I never raised, and in no way showed it was contradictory in any way. I see no real relevance to my position and how that undermines the argument I presented tonight. He didn't address any of the other points that I presented in cross-examining, which would be an important time to do that in cross-examination. You have me 5 minutes, make me look foolish in this position, but we didn't see any of that. I'm hoping the next cross-ex will be more on the position. Now, he said that, he referred again to most of his time, at least a good portion of it, to Matt Slick and the cosmological argument. I didn't mention Matt Slick, I don't use his materials, and I didn't use the cosmological argument. They are irrelevant to my position. I didn't use that tonight. And so what we see here, I think, is Dan is wrestling with this issue. He has no good reason for the uniformity of nature, or that his perceptions are generally reliable, or that his memory is generally reliable. And so now he's just filling time, talking about Matt Slick and an argument I don't use. Okay, if we're going to reason in this debate, we're going to deal with our opponent's position, then we need to deal with what they actually said in the debate. Now, I'm going to throw Dan a bone here tonight. Okay, contrary to what he said in the past, and this argument not being falsifiable, it actually is falsifiable in one of three ways. You could undermine the Christian position as being able to justify that we know the world is the way it is, and he is yet to make good on that claim. He's claimed it. I've seen no good argument that that's actually contradiction. Second, he could show how he actually knows the universe is uniform, or his perceptions are generally reliable, or his memory is generally reliable, given his experience. Okay, you want to reject the biblical God? Great. Now, how do you justify then these pre-commitments to your knowledge that don't have to be the case? They don't have to be this way. Nothing illogical or impossible about it. And so if you have two possibilities, reliable and unreliable, if you have no good reason for one over the other, then you're completely ignorant to the reality of the world. And if you're ignorant at that foundation because everything is built upon these assumptions, then you're ignorant to everything else upon it. You couldn't even make sense of your models if you didn't know the world was this way, in any sense. And lastly, he could show some kind of error in the form of the transcendental argument. Philosophers that tried to do this, especially in the 60s and 70s, like Barry Stroud and Corner and some others, Grayling, and some others have tried to undermine transcendental arguments, talking about the conceptual, ontological problem, and the rest. He could bring up those issues, which would be legitimate gripes to my position, which I'd be willing to discuss, but we don't hear that coming forward, because he's not actually dealing with the position. Again, how do we know the world is the way it is? We know because God made the world. He's reliable, he's not deceptive, he made it to be reliable, and that you can understand it in a reliable way. And he reveals that to you even in your conscience and in your functioning. He also tells us this in Scripture. I have a positive case, it's sufficient, and it is a justification for us knowing the world is this way. If you want to deny that, go ahead. You want to laugh at it and throw your arms up and do all these gyrations, that's fine, you can do those things. That's not logical. In fact, to make sense of your gyrations, you'd have to assume my God, which is to refute yourself from the impossibility of the contrary. Thank you.
Well, you're probably going to be disappointed with this cross because it's. I'm going to talk about miracles a little bit. Let's see right here. I'm going to quote again Dr. Greg Bonson. He said, "quote The supernatural power of the working of a miracle may be the living and true God whom people should worship and obey, but it may also be the prince of darkness, the devil, who wishes to deceive men and lead them into soul-damning error." He didn't explain in this paper that he wrote how he distinguishes between the two. How would you distinguish between a miracle from God and a miracle from the devil, I guess?
Since the devil is always trying to change Scripture and have someone worship him over the true God, miracles or apparent miracles, as I would grant to you, a lot of apparent miracles, even in the church, where someone felt something and they were healed miraculously on these televangelist shows and the rest. They may happen in certain quarters if someone gets healed like that, but I'm skeptical of a lot of that stuff that's actually real. It's not just their emotion taking over. But how would I discern then these miracles being from God or from the devil? Does it accord with Scripture? Because the devil does not want you to worship this God as revealed in Scripture. All miracles that are against the Bible, which inevitably they will be, that's how I make the discernment. The Bible is my standard to discern that.
Gotcha. Okay. He also lays out in this paper, by the way, it's called The Problem of Miracles. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. But
I have not read it.
he's actually arguing for miracles. You know the title is The Problem of Miracles. But he lays out three conditions. I'll just read them really quick. He says that in order for it to be a miracle, it must be essentially an amazing event. It must be exceed normal human ability. and the purpose of such events must point beyond themselves to some special theological lesson. I guess my first question is, would you agree with those criteria for something to be a miracle?
Sure, I think so. I haven't thought through very deeply, systematically about what constitutes a miracle, because some people say, well, even just God upholding the world is a miracle, but we experience that so regularly, it's not, a miracle. So, but
It wouldn't be amazing in that case.
well, I think it's amazing, but it's more regular than these individual miracles you speak of. So,
Okay.
sure, that's fine. You can go.
Yeah, just for clarification, he actually excludes things like hurricanes because he says those are actually quite natural. So that wouldn't, even though it meets all the other criteria, it wouldn't be considered a miracle. So his...
Well, let me clarify that for a second.
Okay.
You're using Greg Bonson. He would grant that God can use naturalistic means to bring about miracles.
Okay,
Like the parting of the Red Sea, there was a strong wind that came and parted the sea, and people walked across it. Okay, so he's not against God sometimes using naturalistic means to create things that are miraculous. Like he created the world, and he used physical elements from the world to create, other beings. Or the land rose and the water went down. These are, naturalistic happenings, but we would say they're miracles because of the uniqueness of them.
Well, actually, he disagrees because he specifically points to hurricanes. He says, because we know the natural origin, that they're quote unquote quite natural, so it doesn't count as a miracle.
No, he means that we don't see wind coming and dividing seas like we see hurricanes happening all the time. Okay, and so in that, yes, because it naturalistically occurs all the time with no real discernment of I'm judging this person, I'm judging that person, and we would say that's a miracle. Now, if God sent a flood that naturalistically caused, like there was water inside the earth that sprung up,
Right.
he would not I know he would not disagree with that.
Maybe this will clarify. He said, quote, "The miracle is an extraordinary event which in its character cannot be explicated by known natural principles or controlled by mere human beings." Unquote.
Yeah, and a wind that could divide a sea for hours with two walls cannot be naturalistically explained in the sense of like, that doesn't happen all the time. God, you would have to use naturalistic means to make that event happen. I don't see how this is relevant.
Well, my question is, so can you tell me what the argument from ignorance is?
The argument for ignorance?
Just a quick
we
explanation of what that is.
We don't know how this happened.
Right.
And so, we don't, I don't know how this happened, and therefore,
Right, it creates, the Wikipedia definition is it's something that creates a false dichotomy. And then you rule out one, therefore you automatically grant the other. Is that not what you're saying when you say it cannot be explained by natural processes, therefore it is a miracle? Isn't that an argument from ignorance?
absolutely not. What it's showing is that this ignorance is at the very foundation of your position. It's not ignorance in like, there's a cat on the table. We're going over our time, but don't worry, it's fine. There's a cat on the table, and you turn off the lights, and you turn it back on, and the cat's over there. You say, are we ignorant to exactly how the cat got over there? Of course we are. Okay? That's not the same thing in that you are ignorant at the very foundation of everything you claim to know. Because from ignorance, you can't build knowledge. So that's not the same thing.
Gonna roll right into yours?
Yes, let me grab. Now I was going to jump into perception, but I would assume that would go the same way as the uniformity of nature dialogue went. And so I'm going to proceed to some other questions, and then if we have time, get back to perception. Can we have absolute certainty?
Can we have, you're talking about logical certainty.
Yes, I am.
What we do is we actually assume logical certainty.
We do.
But that actually has to be taken provisionally. So what we're doing is assuming that something is the case universally. But if there ends up being evidence that contradicts it, then we change our model because
Sure.
that's the way that we build our
So
model.
can you have absolute certainty?
Well,
Is there
again,
absolute certainty in anything? If everything is provisionally true, then you don't have absolute certainty in anything.
well, we operate as if there is absolute certainty.
But you don't have absolute certainty in anything.
I don't have absolute certainty. Well, ultimately, everything comes down to...
Do you have absolute certainty in any
provisional.
proposition being true?
Of absolute certainty in any proposition being true. No, it's not. The problem is that ends up setting up a question.
Which I'm going to get to.
Right, that's unanswerable.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah,
So let
because
me ask it.
but you say, are you absolutely certain that there's no absolute certainty?
Exactly.
Right, and that's an unanswerable question.
Well, for you, that's why you don't state there's no absolute certainty. Because to affirm absolute certainty, yet you're trying to deny it, which is a contradiction.
That's why we have to operate as if there's absolute certainty.
Okay, but do you actually have absolute certainty?
Again, what you're doing is you're setting up it's a question. I'll give you an example.
Let me rephrase.
Let me answer this. It sets up a question, and the question is the same as if I said, never take my advice. If you take my advice, you're not taking my advice. If you don't take my advice, you're taking my advice. So no matter which way you go, it ends up being a
Which is
contradiction.
why it's absurd to say.
That's why that's why the question is absurd.
Which is why it would be logically absurd to say there's no absolute certainty.
That's why I'm saying that we accept it provisionally.
So, but do you...
We operate as if there is.
Okay, let's rephrase it, because you said this in different ways. Do you agree that knowledge without the possibility of error is a contradiction?
Knowledge without the possibility of error is a contradiction. Well, it depends on how you define knowledge, but
Justified true belief.
the problem with justified true belief is, you probably know the Gideon problem, which showed
I do.
that our common conception of knowledge can be justified and true, and we can believe it, and it can still not be knowledge. So that ends up being a problem.
Okay, I will define justification as grounded deontologically and with adequate evidence. Getty addressed just deontological justification, not with adequate evidence. So I ask you again, do you agree that knowledge without the possibility of error is a contradiction?
That ends up setting up the same
How do you define knowledge?
impossible answer. Because what you're doing is you're saying that in order for something to be true, justified true belief, that you have to have absolute certainty of its truth.
Okay. Have you stated this in a past debate?
Have I stated?
In a past talk, have you stated to have knowledge without the possibility of error is a contradiction? You said that, affirming that proposition.
I don't recall. I probably said lots of
You
things,
have.
and I may have
You
made
have.
mistakes.
It's a quote from you.
Okay.
So will you retract that quote then? And not use that anymore in the future?
Read the specific quote.
You claim that knowledge without the possibility of error is a contradiction. It's to undermine the presuppositional argument that you can have knowledge without the possibility of error. That's what you were critiquing. So will you in the future, maybe it's in your bookkeeping, you can find it, will you retract that and not use it going forward? Which would be fine, you could do that.
Yeah, but are you actually quoting what I'm saying? I'm not. You're like paraphrasing what I'm saying.
People are welcome to go to the YouTube channel.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just want to know exactly
I
what it
didn't think
is
you'd actually
was described.
lose memory that you've said this before, because you say it.
I don't know where. I don't recall.
Okay. Do you? Let's change this. Do you only believe things that you can verify with your senses?
No.
Okay. What else do you believe that you cannot verify with your senses?
I believe I exist.
Okay. So that's a belief.
Yes.
Okay. Do you believe that nature is uniform?
Yes.
Can you verify that with your senses?
No.
Okay. So
Well,
what?
wait. I can verify in an inductive sense.
Well, that's what verifying. Yes. Inductive. Yes. Okay. So what justification do you have, getting back to uniformity, that the future will be like the past?
We're going back to
And
the inductive argument.
Okay, but because to verify, you'd have to already know the future will be like the past. Okay. But do you have a good reason that it will be like the past? Just beyond just you assume it's that way.
You don't accept this as a good reason, but as I've explained, within the model that works best for us today, well, I'm assuming the uniformity of nature.
Okay.
Okay, everybody having fun? This is what I call fun. All right. So it's said that few doubted the existence of God until philosophers tried to prove it. This is perhaps because as far back as the Greek philosopher Socrates and his priority of definitions, it was recognized that a proper definition was, if not essential to understanding something, at least essential to communicating it. So, if John wants us to believe what he believes, to accept the Christian biblical God in all his omniscient, Trinitarian, and incomprehensible glory, then he's going to have to sort out the coherent from the incoherent, the rational from the irrational. But, as I've shown, when we do that, we don't end up with the personal being that is laboriously detailed in the Philadelphia Confession. We don't end up with an anthropomorphic being at all. We end up with what, in a very narrow sense, Paul Tillich might call the ground of all being. Reality, existence itself. Now, I'm told there are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on all the beaches of Earth. I don't say that because it's amazing, although it's very amazing. I say it because John is presenting us with a vision of God that comes from a people that didn't even know what a star was. They didn't know that bacteria and viruses cause disease, or even that the Earth is a sphere. I'm not blaming them for that. That's just the way that it is. But why would we ignore everything we've learned in the last 2,000 years and just accept that they got the most important question right? It seems natural that the ancient Jews or Christians would believe in the gods they constructed. But the real question is, why do we still believe? The answer lies not in the cosmos, but in here, in our human nature. Now, I live on Lake Ontario, on the shore about 15 miles north of here. And just 2 days ago, as I was actually preparing for this debate, I was sitting at my desk and I looked out of my window and I saw a large ship in the distance. I grabbed my binoculars and took a closer look. Wouldn't you know, I could clearly see that it was a ship and it was upside down. I'm not kidding, it was upside down. Now, I don't have a high-power lens from my camera, so this is unfortunately the best picture I could get. But trust me, with my binoculars, it was unmistakably inverted. So was this a miracle? Was it a sign from God that John was somehow going to turn my arguments on their head? Some of you may think so. What about Paul or Saul on the road to Damascus? Now, this may be the most important miracle story in the Bible. He's said to have seen a flash of light and then been terrified by the sight and sound of Jesus. Was that really a miracle? Well, what about the symptoms of certain form of temporal lobe epilepsy? Visual and auditory hallucinations, extreme emotional feelings of fear and anxiety, a loss of your sense of self, a feeling of awe and oneness with everything. So did Saul or Paul get a visit by Jesus on the road to Damascus, or was it simply an epileptic seizure? It seems that not just ancient man, but many of us are willing to take an unexplained event and wrap it with intent and call it a miracle. That's just the way that we're wired. Hundreds or even thousands of people have experienced like Saul's or even mine every day. And we're no more getting a message from God than Saul was. What about the upside down ship? Okay, it looked upside down, but I also happen to know, especially this time of year when the water is cold and warm air comes in over it, that you get a very dense layer of colder air right at the surface, and you have the warmer, less dense air above it, and it creates a lens effect that actually bends the light. Voila, upside down ship. Now, what if I didn't know that? What if I wasn't an engineer that knew the physics of how light bends? I might think that it's a miracle. That's the way that we're wired to think in those terms. No, you can't blame people for what they don't know. But now that you know. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for sitting through this debate and being such a, I say, gracious and engaging audience. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you, Dan, again, for another good debate. I really have appreciated this debate, and especially our meal prior to it. In all seriousness, I have enjoyed my time here. There are a number of things that we can take from tonight's debate, and I think the most glaring one is philosophically, if you look at what Dan is saying, he has no justification for his position, ultimately. Atheists are very quick to deny the biblical God. They relish in that decision. They love their own autonomy from God. And yet when they're actually pressed to justify this autonomy, to actually justify them knowing things in this world in a way that's consistent with this position, we don't get answers that are logical. We get things like, well, we construct models based on that our perceptions are generally reliable, memory is generally reliable, and nature is uniform. Of course, we construct models based on those assumptions. Okay, that's not the issue. That's not, if you read Hume and you read philosophers after him that deal with this, and especially Bertrand Russell, that's conceded, that's granted in this. The issue is just because you operate upon that assumption doesn't mean it actually is that way. Okay, do you have a good reason that it actually is that way? And we see none coming forth. And so you see at the very bottom of the atheist position, the very foundation is complete ignorance. No good reason for their position. That's why Van Til said so pointedly, his logic, the unbelievers, is merely the exercise of a revolving door in a void, moving nothing from nowhere into the void. Okay? Atheists have no good reason for the preconditions of their knowledge. No good reason that they actually hold. None. Now, Christians have a good reason. This is not an inductive argument. We have a positive case. You may not like that. You may not like that it's, children can understand it. They can present it in Sunday school-like language. Like, Johnny, we know the world is this way because God told us it is. And because God knows these things, and he made the world, and he doesn't lie, we can trust him. Simple, not obscure, understandable by young children. And yet, if you want to deny it and laugh at it, you have to be irrational to do so. Okay, it's the whole point of the transcendental argument. Dan has a YouTube video, and you can confirm all these things from his videos online. He has a YouTube video where he says that the presuppositional method is to present some obscure, complicated argument, hoping you won't do further research, hoping you won't actually dig into the argument. Because once you show the simple fallacy of it, they'll retreat, and they won't actually engage with you in debate. Now, I specifically singled Dan out to have the debate on this because that's not the case with me. Okay, he's had years to study this argument. I gave him even more time after we had 9 months or whatever since we agreed to this debate for him to do research on this. Okay, research does not solve your problem in this. Logically, if you were consistent, the more research you do, the more you should be aware of how false your position is. There are other issues that are just as damaging for the atheist, like the one in the many problem, which goes back thousands of years in philosophy. You have a world full of particulars, and somehow this is in unity to make it intelligible. It doesn't have to be that way, and hence it's been a problem for philosophers. None of them have disagreed that we have to assume it's this way. At least that's my understanding. Okay, but the problem comes in, the reason why they're wrestling with this is that just because we assume it's this way does not logically follow it is this way. There are other problems as well. And this is why Van Til said that but when all the reprobate are epistemologically self-conscious, the crack of doom has come. Do all the research you want. When you understand and realize that the only way you can make sense of this world, the only way you can enjoy the goodness of this creation is by borrowing from the biblical God, this truth should bring you to your knees. Sadly, people reject that, and they're free to do so, to reject God. And his punishment, will come in due time. His common grace is keeping you here, but eventually that will run out, and you will be judged. But it doesn't have to be this way. Christ died on the cross so the wrath of God could go from man to Christ. But you have to submit to Christ. You have to repent of your sins and turn to him. There is no other way. Thank you.
I'd like to take questions alternately. First one to Dan, then one to John. Maybe 3 for each of them. And they'll have a chance, for the person addressed will have a chance to answer, and then the other debater will have a short time to respond. Okay, down in the front.
My question, Dan, is there's inductive arguments based on our observation, deductive arguments based on our assumptions. Are those the only 2 types of arguments that you could say result in truth as good as our observations or as good as our assumptions, our axioms?
Did everybody hear the question? Inductive, deductive, is that it?
I'm really just trying to sort it out in my own head. Is there another option in your view besides an inductive argument and a deductive argument?
I'm not a philosopher, so I haven't studied this exhaustively, but as far as I know, it's either an inductive or deductive argument as far as the logical arguments.
I would say there's a third category, that's transcendental arguments.
Okay, a question for Jon?
So you were essentially arguing between Christianity and what you called unchristianity. And I was just wondering if you specifically used Christianity and unchristianity, or you took time to consider other religions, other thought processes, and how they may differ from atheism. I'm wondering if you could just speak briefly about that.
Yeah, the non-Christian position logically has to include all the other, I would say, false theistic positions. So yes, I have considered them, and I think they all can be reduced to the same kind of error. Either something is so similar to Christianity that you have to affirm parts of the Bible as being true, like Mormons do, or Muslims, or Jehovah's Witnesses. And then from there, I would reason either from the scriptures that they're being inconsistent with that, which I think can be objectively shown that they're being inconsistent with that, or their conception of God is logically incoherent to make sense of our experience. I would either go one of those two ways on that. If you get religions that have an impersonal God or something that doesn't communicate to them, then you have problems with the same problem the atheist has.
What you're getting at is, again, I'll refer to Dr. Greg Bonson. He's done some work in this area, as well as Van Til, in trying to create this, what I call a false dichotomy between Christianity and everything that's not Christianity. And they recognize that what they're trying to do for this logical certainty, as I mentioned before, was they're trying to lump everything together in non-Christianity so that by the impossibility of all of that, their argument can stand. The problem with that, in the way they do that, is they say that everything that's non-Christian ultimately relies upon human autonomy. And that's the catch-all that everything else is supposed to fit into. The problem with that is it's demonstrably true that not everything relies upon human autonomy. For example, if you read Sam Harris, he talks about a kind of determinism that I think has a lot of credibility, a kind of determinism where we actually, what we think is a choice, is actually something that we become aware of after it already occurs in our brains. So, in fact, the universe, if you would, is conspiring to behave in a certain way, and we're not actually influencing that. We're just becoming aware of how we interact with that. So that is clearly not a human autonomous position. Hindus, for example, they believe everything is an illusion. That's also not a human autonomy position. So we can demonstrably show that there are positions that are non-Christians that don't fit into that human autonomy catch-all.
Another question for Dan?
My question to Dan is in this debate that you've had, both you and Jon stayed at a totally philosophical level. When you're at that level, you're really never going to find an answer. Like Jon's answer is that the answer is God. And he says, if you're against that, then you're being foolish. There's no evidence. There's nothing. There's no argument in that. So why didn't you? I don't understand why this debate did not expand past these philosophical arguments. You never went into. There was never anything like, are you certain of anything? I'm certain the world is round. You are certain of something. It seems like this. You both got yourself trapped in these philosophical arguments where you would never answer a concrete question. And it was frustrating to listen to both of you because you would not answer them. And I just wonder why is that why won't anyone answer a question? Is there anything that you're certain of?
Right.
Certain the world is round.
Okay. Well, let me take that seriously. In fact, my understanding is that science actually fits within a philosophical context. So philosophy is a sense of a broader category of which science is part. In fact, before we used the term science, we called it natural philosophy.
Yeah, but having said that science is.
But let me answer the question about the certainty certainty of the Earth being a sphere, okay? That's an inductive argument, as I mentioned, because what we're doing is assuming, to start, that we have sense perception, okay? And then we're taking the evidence of seeing a snapshot of Earth from the moon, for example, and seeing the spherical shape. So what we're doing is we're starting from the starting point that we can assume that our sense perception is correct, and then we're adding evidence to that to construct a model. But that's still an inductive argument. And an inductive argument is necessarily uncertain. It doesn't mean we can't be very, very confident that the Earth is, I'm not arguing the Earth is flat. All the evidence points to the Earth being a sphere. No, I don't think anybody will. Some people might disagree with that, but that seems obvious. But that's still an inductive argument. And that's, again, you're asking me to step outside of the realm of philosophy, which is the very means by which we make sense of the world. So I don't know how to do that.
I tend to disagree with you there, but that's...
I would agree with a lot of what Dan said. I mean, to deny using philosophical arguments is itself to use a philosophical argument. You don't inductively prove your question purely inductively. You use, and I would agree, induction can be a subset of philosophy. He said there's no argument in my position. I think very clearly there is an argument in my position. I've shown that I have a positive case for why I know the world is a certain way and why you do as well. And that based on that assumption that's true, you can then actually have truth. You can have knowledge of truth in this world. Now, and I don't think that, I think it is an argument, and so I would, yeah, and you didn't show any way it's not an argument. Now, Dan talked about a false dichotomy. This is not a false dichotomy, okay? Matthew 28:17, Jesus said you're either for him or against him. You logically cannot be a third option, okay? And autonomy, as Greg Bahnsen and Van Til said, is where it's autonomy to God, the Christian God. Okay, so given their definition of autonomy, which you should be using when you critique them, it's the same as Matthew 28:17. So there is no third option logically. Christ did not leave that open to you. You have to deny his neutrality. Okay, he denied neutrality. If you affirm neutrality, that's to deny his denial of neutrality. You cannot be a third option.
Can I just correct you real briefly? You
As
said,
long as I can do that.
no, it's okay.
Okay.
That's a conversation.
Sure.
You said at the beginning, you said that I was saying that you didn't have an argument.
No. He said that in his question.
Oh, okay.
Can you clarify when you say, you said that you know, and then you say, how did you say? And I know.
Are you talking to John or me?
To John.
John.
What do you mean by, there's a reason I know?
For it to be the case that we have knowledge and experience, it must be the case that Christianity is true. God had to reveal to us the nature of the world, the nature of man, the nature of himself to us, to justify us actually knowing the world is this way. We cannot justify these things solely given our experience.
So what you're saying is that you know that, but that is not a belief. That is a fact. But you just stated
No, it's
fact.
a belief that's absolutely true.
No, it can't be a belief.
Why? Why?
Either it is true or it isn't. A belief
Of course.
cannot be absolutely true.
Why?
Because a belief is talking about this is what I believe based on my.
Yes, I believe the Christian God exists, not only existentially in my experience and how God reveals himself in that sense, but also epistemologically with certainty. I see no contradiction in saying that.
There's no certainty in a belief. You can't use the word belief and use certainty.
Yeah, I see no reason why that's the case, but
No, there is a reason is because a belief is not a fact. A belief is a belief. There's no certainty in any belief. You can't use the word belief and truth together.
Yeah, I disagree
And
with
truth and fact together.
I disagree with that. I think people, and we're not going to get anywhere with this just by.
But you can't.
Okay, but that's not an argument.
All right, let's go on to another question, and I think this one should be addressed to John in the back.
So you keep talking about absolute certainty, and you keep saying that there's no way that we can be absolutely certain about pretty much anything. So then my question for you, it's kind of a two-parter. Are you absolutely certain that the answer is God? And I'm assuming that you're going to say yes. So then, if that's the case, then were you there when the book was written and when people were telling the stories? Were you there to experience it? So personally, for you, can you be absolutely certain that you have the answer?
We do have absolute certainty. I don't say we don't have absolute certainty. I don't deny that. I affirm we have absolute certainty. In no way have I presented something contrary to that tonight. I apologize if I said something contrary to that.
You kept questioning everything he was saying, though, saying
Yeah,
you
because
absolutely.
exactly. Okay, so here's the distinction, though, is that given his position, if he truly wants to be consistent with denying God in all things, okay, being truly autonomous in that, he cannot justify the very foundation of his position. When it's logically possible, that foundation is different from the way he assumes it to be. I have a good reason for why the world actually is that way. Not only why I know it to be that way, why you know it to be that way. And I think, hold on, I think that not only do Christians have certainty, I think non-Christians, unbelievers have certainty as well. One of those things being in God's existence. You laugh at that, and you say, well, you know, how do you know that? Again, from the possibility of the contrary. If this God did not exist, you couldn't even understand the questioning of his existence. So I don't deny certainty for people.
Let me just address that really quickly. I think what you're seeing here is that what's happening is he's begging the question. What he's saying is, if God exists, then this is the case, which is presuming, obviously, that God exists in the first place. I don't want to beat the dead horse with this whole certainty thing. I think it's pretty obvious that we create models of the universe and we take it provisionally. That's just the way that it works. And we don't have to assert certainty. And what John was trying to do with his questions is try to undermine my sense of certainty or try to catch me in a contradiction so that he can then assert certainty about his God. And all he's trying to do is move away from a provisional understanding of reality of the universe and put it outside of that in some, he calls transcendental, a metaphysical entity outside of our experience that is somehow the grounds of this. It just doesn't work.
But may I respond? Yes, of course, I have to assume God, to prove God. Okay, that's the point of transcendental. You have to do the same thing when you affirm the laws of logic. Or if you had to make an argument to someone that your perceptions were generally reliable, you'd have to assume they're generally reliable to then make that argument. Okay, so yes, there's an inherent circularity in that sense. I never denied that, I affirmed that. Okay, but there's a distinction between viciously circular and spirally circular. If you say that my senses are provisionally valid because they're provisionally valid, you're not saying anything in a justification for why they actually are provisionally valid. That'd be viciously circular. Okay, in that sense, that begging the question would not be correct. Now, transcendental circular reasoning, which is a valid third type of proof, yes, is circular, but the justification goes beyond the mere restating that we need it. It shows that these need to be the precondition for us to have knowledge.
Can I ask a question? You say that the atheist can't know tomorrow will be the same as today because he doesn't believe in God.
And you do know it's the same because you do believe in God. Do you know that God won't change tomorrow?
I do.
How do you know that?
Because he revealed himself in such a way that he is an unchanging God. He doesn't lie, he doesn't contradict himself. He is a reliable God. And just to clarify, I do think you know tomorrow will be like today. I do think you know. I don't know if you're...
I don't know that. No, I don't.
No, okay, well, it's a mission. But I do think atheists know tomorrow will be like today. I completely affirm that. But they can't do that. They can't know that consistently with the ignorance in the foundation of their position.
Let me just quickly respond. What you're pointing to is the problem of miracles. Is that the miracle is by its very definition a violation of the uniformity that God has supposedly promised. And that's what I was trying to drive at with my questions of miracles, is how do you know that it's really a miracle? It ends up being, it's very clearly an argument from ignorance. Well, if it's not natural, then it must be a miracle. And God is therefore operating outside the uniformity that he promised. But how do we know, first of all, that it's something that we just haven't come to understand? I mean, years ago, we could have looked at lightning and said, well, there's no natural explanation, voila, it's a miracle. Well, now that we know that it's not a miracle. In fact, the whole idea of miracles, the further you go, you realize the very concept ends up being irrational. Again, it's an argument from ignorance.
Can you respond to The problem is that you'll never come to know the answer to this because you can't even get started. This isn't this that you get somewhere and you don't know how you got there. Okay, it's not that kind of appeal to ignorance. It's that you can't even get started. If you do not know tomorrow will be like today, if you don't know that, if you're going to be consistent with that, you'd have to continually test in every second of your existence until you die whether you actually still know what you knew in the past. And we can go the same thing with sense perception, same thing with the reliability of your memory. And so, yes, could we come to understand in the future? You'd have to borrow from my God to even get started, which refutes the very thing you're trying to deny, which is my God. Okay, it's self-refuting.
All right, I'm looking for a final question for Dan.
Well, I think this is, maybe I'm very ignorant because I don't understand, and I, too, cannot be sure what's going to happen tomorrow. I can assume, as a human being, as we all are in this room, we all make assumptions that things will be the way that we assume they will be. But nothing's going to tell me that nothing devastating is going to happen to myself, my family, any other loved ones, without any explanation. And how can we assume that, say like families in the Midwest are experiencing these bad weather situations right now. They had no idea that they were going to be hit with this. So how do they prepare themselves for things like that without testing the waters? As human beings, I think we all assume that things will change at some point in our lives. Right. And whether there's a God or not a God, we can always expect some sort of change.
And so your question?
So I'm trying to figure out how in the world can we believe and not make these assumptions in either case.
Yeah, well, I guess I would agree with you. We do make assumptions. Just interestingly, you're talking about the tornadoes in the Midwest and so forth. And devastations. I saw an interesting photo where all this devastation was occurring, and then across the street in big letters across a building that obviously wasn't completely destroyed was something to the effect of "Thank you, God." And I thought this is very interesting because what that sets up is a scenario where, well, first of all, they're apparently thanking God for wiping out their neighbors, which seems odd. But what you end up with is a situation that's unfalsifiable. So if you're the one that gets struck by the tornado, well, that's God's will and there's some mysterious plan behind it. If you're the one that's not struck by the tornado, well, that's God's will, and obviously He was showing mercy to me. It's completely unfalsifiable, which in my last debate I kind of explained. If God is a cause for anything, there are criteria that they have to meet, and one is the falsifiability part. So by the very nature of the way that God is referenced in these types of tragedies shows that it's a concept that's not falsifiable. So there's no basis to claim Him as, even if it was a coherent concept, as the cause of anything.
I would agree that we assume some things will change in the future. The assumption of uniformity of nature is not just that, it's that how hurricanes acted in the past, whether I'm going to experience them or not, maybe that may change. But how they acted in the past will be the same way in the future. Okay? So the point being, though, is that if you have no good reason for why the future will actually be like the past, to be logically consistent with that ignorance, you'd have to continually test everything you claim to know about the past to be consistent with that. Now, people don't act consistently with that, and praise God for that. Okay, that's how they know things. They actually know the world will be, tomorrow will be like today, because they borrow from God to do so. They clearly don't borrow from their own position. Now, he says things that, thanking God for destroying your neighbors. I don't know why they wrote those things, and if that's why they're saying it, obviously I think that's wrong. But they could be saying, thank you, God, for the grace that I'm still here. Okay, I mourn that these people were, killed, but I'm thankful that I'm still here. Just like some pastors, when they lose children, are so thankful that they have other children that survive. Because no one deserves to actually live. Everyone's a sinner against God. Even people who are redeemed still do not deserve to be here because we still rebel. We still don't live in accordance with His will. But praise God, by His common grace, we get to usually live full lives, long lives, and enjoy this world. But it's by His grace that we do so. So we should be thankful even in the down times as well as the up times, which everyone experiences.
Just one quick rebut to that. I just want to go on record here. I think John deserves to live.
All right, a final question for John. Was there one over here on the side? No, okay. The guy in the white shirt.
John, the attributes that you ascribe to the Christian God and that make your argument valid, they're held in common with many other worldviews. So I'm wondering how you can say those attributes make your argument valid when, or even more valid than the other ones.
Yeah, that's a very good question. What's interesting is that if you get, this is an objection that Corner gave and some others have given in the past as well philosophically, is couldn't you just ape Christianity or just ape this position and change it, and make some attributes of a deity that would fulfill these preconditions? The problem with that is if you either get something so distant to the biblical God, either that this God has certain attributes, but He's deistic, like He's so removed from the creation you don't actually know Him. Okay, well that of course wouldn't function as a justification for knowing the world's this way because He doesn't communicate to you. Okay, so it's either so distant from the biblical God, or it's so close that they have to borrow from the biblical God to even make sense of their God. Okay, so they have to affirm parts of the Bible like Mormons do, or Jehovah's Witnesses, or Muslims. And if they do that, I would then reason with them, which is consistent with my argument. I would assume the truth of my position, reason with them from the Scriptures that they can't logically either affirm the whole Bible and the Book of Mormon, which contradicts, or affirm parts of the Bible, like the Muslims do, and the Quran, which also contradicts. Or if they make it, and a second way I would also talk to them is if they have a concept of God that is incoherent as well, like the Mormons. Some believe that God was once truly finite. He was not always infinite, He was truly finite. I would show how that's impossible, to be truly finite, like in your entire being, and then become infinite, okay, or be infinite and become truly finite, okay? By the way, Christ did not do that. The Son of God took on a human nature that was finite, but He was still the Son of God in His divine nature, so it's not the same thing. Anyway, we could go into more, but that's how I would reason with them in this. And it's a good discussion to have, and it should be done.
I mean, your question is why specifically the Christian God? And let's just look at omnipotence as one of the particular attributes of this Christian God. And the reason why presupposing some existence with all of these particular attributes doesn't make sense. If we look at omnipotence, as I said in my talk, non-omnipotence makes perfect sense. It's a coherent concept. So we can't say that omnipotence, which is itself nonsense, because you would need to have infinite knowledge in order to claim to know that something is omnipotent. But non-omnipotence is coherent. So now we have omnipotent versus non-omnipotent, and we need some type of justification for that. And if you need to justify it, then you don't need to presuppose it. That's the whole idea. What I call this the Trojan horse position, because what John is arguing for, when you take all those attributes away, he's arguing for reality itself. Once you accept reality, he's kind of roll it in through the gates, and guess what? Once you accept that, he's got a little surprise. All of these other attributes are inside the Trojan horse, the omnipotence, omniscience, the Trinitarianness. All that kind of stuff comes as a package deal. And what you're saying is, well, how do we decipher that whole package from any other package that has the same reality-based, core to it when you strip everything else away?
May I respond to that? It's interesting that Dan in no way showed omnipotence to be incoherent. He didn't cross-examine me on that. I wish he would have. Omnipotence is God has infinite power in a way that's consistent with His nature, and he would get into what we mean by that, each word in that. And I can show you it's not in any way incoherent and cannot be applied to just any random thing in creation, which he's accused of, or he has said in the past. Notice he said that Again, he's saying that you couldn't know that God is omnipotent because you would have to have infinite knowledge yourself. Do you know that with certainty, Dan? He doesn't know that with certainty, which he was trying to dodge in our cross-examination. And because he doesn't know it with certainty, then it must be possible. Okay, it's not impossible, it's possible. Well, if it's possible, then it can't be a contradiction, because contradictions are not possible. This is my point. He has said this in past video. It is a self-refuting to make these kind of claims.
John, what do you know, sir?
I think we need to end here. And I thank you all for your attention and your questions, and thank you, John and Dan.